This program will demonstrate the procedure for measuring and adjusting the valve clearances or lash on the V-rod. We will be showing the specific details for the removal and installation of the camshaft components. Preliminary steps will only be outlined. Always consult the specific service manual for the most current and complete instructions and specifications. We suggest that you view PhD 161 and 162 prior to this program. The service interval for checking the valve lash on the Revolution engine is currently 10,000 miles. We will begin by securing the motorcycle to the lift. Always use a frame jack or hold-down straps to stabilize the bike on the lift for service. The airbox assembly will have to be removed to access the valve covers. When removing the lower airbox, remember to loosen the rear breather hose clamp before lifting. Remove the coolant line to the expansion tank and disconnect the battery cables. Negative first. Lift the battery strap up over the top of the front brackets and pull the battery out of its tray. Next, remove the fuel lines from the manifold. Take precautions, as a small amount of pressurized fuel will escape. To remove the fuel lines, press the two blue pads in and pull the line off. Remove the fuel lines from the fuel tank. A small quantity of fuel will drain out of the fuel lines, so be prepared with some absorbent towels. With the fuel lines disconnected, pull them out towards the front of the bike. Remove the 3 ground wires attached to the rear head and single wire attached to the front head. Next, remove the front and rear cylinder ignition coils. Remove the IAC and TP sensor connectors and loosen the 2 clamps at the base of the throttle body. Pull up on the throttle body to remove it and wrap it for protection. Secure it out of the way, leaving the throttle cables attached. Cover the intakes to prevent objects from falling in them. Next, remove the ground cable from the front cylinder head. Remove the bolt and slide the clamp, securing the coolant lines towards the back of the bike. Loosen the clamps and remove the front and rear breather hoses from the heads. With a small screwdriver, press the latch in and push the wire harness clip off the frame post. Repeat this for the second harness clip on the left side. Finally, unlatch the clamp and free the vapor valve and the lines from the frame. To gain access to the front cylinder, remove the left louvered frame cover and the right cover along with the coolant expansion tank. Now we are ready to loosen all of the cam cover bolts. 3 frame holes are provided for access to the rear covers. Use a 5mm long ball end hex tool to access the cover bolts. The ball end will compensate for the various angles that you will encounter. Always make sure that the ball end has penetrated the bolt to prevent deforming the hex in the bolt. Most of the rear cover fasteners are exposed and easy to reach. Back out all of the fasteners evenly in a crossing pattern. The front cylinder cover has some fasteners which have unique access angles. This front side fastener has the most severe angle of all of the fasteners, so use care in seating the ball to prevent stripping. On the right side, the coolant line can be moved to provide access. The long ball driver will slide past the coolant hoses to access the right front fastener. A slot in the battery carrier allows access from above for this fastener. To gain additional clearance, you will be lowering the front of the engine. Begin by supporting the engine with a jack under the front of the oil pan. To prevent the exhaust system from binding, loosen the 2 bolts which attach the lower muffler to the support. Next, loosen the drive belt tension. Loosen the center bolt of the front engine mount. Lower the jack and the engine should drop about 1/2 inch in the front. Now remove the bolts from the cam covers. Carefully separate the partial covers over the cam sprockets and remove them first. The dowels will usually stay in the lower cover, but watch out that they do not fall into the cam chain tunnel. Next, lift up and remove the lower cam cover. You will have to move and manipulate the coolant and wiring harness to free the rear cover. Lift up and move the coolant lines as you pivot the front cover out the right side. Use a universal on the extension when removing the spark plugs to allow the engine to rotate without compression resistance. Remove the alternator derby cover to access the 36mm rotor bolt, used to rotate the engine using the special tool HD 45314. Do not rotate the engine in a clockwise direction. Engine damage may result. Only rotate the engine in a counterclockwise direction. Using the special tool, rotate the engine in a counterclockwise direction while observing the position of the cam lobes. Stop when the front cylinder's intake cam lobes are in the 10 o'clock position and the exhaust are at 2 o'clock. To inspect the rear cylinder, the exhaust will be at 2 o'clock and the intake at 10 o'clock for the inspection. The service manual has photos for reference. We recommend that you use a metric feeler gauge set with long blades like this one for your measuring. Insert the feeler gauge between the cam lobe and the bucket. Do not force the gauge. The reading is correct when you feel a light drag or chattering as you slide the gauge through. Check and record the measurements from all 8 valves on the sheet. Use a copy of the worksheet in the service manual to record your measurements as you measure the valve clearances. The correct valve lash for an intake valve is between 0.195 millimeters and 0.245 millimeters. For exhaust valves, the range is from 0.295 millimeters and 0.345 millimeters. If the lash for all 8 valves is within specification, you can stop and reinstall the cam covers. The job is done. If one or more valves are out of spec, you will proceed to verify the cam timing prior to camshaft removal. We will use this engine to demonstrate the camshaft removal so that the camera can get a clear view. Camshaft removal is done with the engine mounted in the frame. Remove the plug from the timing hole on the right side of the engine case. Thread the TDC reference tool into the spark plug hole. Rotate the engine in a counterclockwise direction while observing the front cylinder's exhaust valve. As the valve closes, observe the TDC reference tool. When the tool is fully extended, insert the TDC locating pin into the timing hole in the crankcase. The tool should drop in flush with the case. If not, gently rock the crankshaft using the turning tool until it does. Check the position of the cam lobes and the timing marks on all 4 camshaft sprockets. Compare your findings to the diagram in the service manual. Note that the colored links on the chains may not be aligned with the marks on the sprockets. The links and the sprocket marks are only used when assembling the components during major overhaul. During the adjustment procedure, we will only be removing one camshaft at a time. If both valves associated with the camshaft are within specifications, you will not need to remove that camshaft. You will service one cylinder at a time. To remove a camshaft, first rotate the engine in a counterclockwise direction until the cam lobes are at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock as shown here. You will be creating your own timing marks for this procedure. Begin by cleaning the oil from the sprocket and chain. Now, using a permanent marking pen, draw a mark on both the sprocket and the chain link on each camshaft. With the cams marked, loosen and remove the secondary chain tensioner. The journal caps are marked with a cast-in arrow which faces towards the other camshaft and a number which is stamped into the cap and the cylinder head. Remove the 2 caps with their dowels from the camshaft being removed. Take care to avoid dropping the parts down in the chain tunnel. With the caps removed, lift the camshaft up and with the chain engaged, roll the cam to the center of the cylinder head. To remove the tappet to access the shim, use a magnet. The shim will usually stick to the inside of the bucket. Mark the tappets so that they are installed back into their original positions. Even though the shims are marked, always measure them with a micrometer and record their thicknesses on the data sheet. Use the sheet to calculate the correct shim size. Refer to the parts information and select the shim closest to the desired size. Seat the shim in the pocket of the retainer and slide the tappet into position. Do not force the tappets in. They should fit with a slight oil film drag. With both valves set, lift the camshaft up and roll it back into place. Do not force the cam or allow the cam to fall off the sprocket. Apply some oil to each journal and lobe and install the caps in the proper locations. Torque the caps to specifications. Repeat the procedure on the other camshaft on this cylinder if needed. After all valves needing adjustment on the cylinder have been set, install the secondary chain tensioner and torque it to 100 Newton meters. Turn the crankshaft 2 full revolutions counterclockwise and realign your timing marks and note the lobe positions. Recheck the lash with the feeler gauges to confirm that they meet specifications. Repeat the process for the other cylinder. Rotate the engine counterclockwise to align the cam lobes as shown in the manual for the cylinder. When all valves have been serviced, you will again verify the cam timing using the TDC reference tool and the TDC locking tool. Compare the locations of the camshaft lobes and all 4 sprocket marks to the diagram in the manual. Reassembly begins by installing the spark plugs to prevent objects from falling into the engine. Next, we will clean the gasket area of the cam covers to remove oil and sealer residue. Apply a gasket compound in several spots to hold the gasket in the channel. Place 2 cable straps next to the aluminum plugs to help keep the gasket in place during assembly. Apply Harley Davidson crankcase sealant to the cutouts in the cylinder head under the plugs. Install the covers from the right side. Note how we twist the front cover to clear the obstructions. Never force the cover. Inspect the gasket during the installation to see if it has dislodged from the cover. Thread the gasket alignment dowel HD 45340 into the cover. This tool positions the gasket around the spark plug port. When the cover is in place, cut the cable straps and remove the alignment dowel. The rear cover is also installed from the right side using a pivoting action. Lift the end caps over the cam chain. The available clearance is tight, but do not force the cover. With the cover in place, cut the 2 cable straps. When installing the cover bolts, you will find that using a magnet will help get the hidden bolts in easier. Torque the bolts using the sequence shown in the service manual. With the covers installed, raise the engine using the jack. Torque the front motor mount to specification. The upper fan motor assembly may rub against the torque wrench, so pay close attention to clearances. Torque the 2 exhaust mounting bolts. Position the main wiring harness and attach the 2 clips to the frame posts. Attach the front and rear breather hoses and tighten the hose clamps. Slide the P-clamp into position on the coolant hoses and attach it to the cylinder head. Attach the 3 ground wires to the rear head and the single wire to the front and torque the bolts to specification. Remove the tape from the intakes and orient the manifold clamps as indicated in the manual. Install the throttle bodies, making sure that they are fully seated. Tighten the clamps from the left side. Reconnect the IAC and TP sensors and route the other harness leads. Install the front and rear ignition coils. Install the coolant expansion tank. Connect the 2 lines to the expansion tank. Install the battery, positive terminal first, and torque the terminals to specifications. The feed and return lines for the fuel system are different diameters. Insert the smaller diameter return fuel line and push the line onto the fuel tank. Push the line on until you hear a click. Now push the fitting onto the manifold line until it clicks. Repeat the procedure for the larger feed line and install it to the tank and manifold. Inspect the routing of all hoses and harnesses, connections, and fittings. Complete the reassembly of the airbox following the directions in the service manual. The final assembly step is to tension the final drive belt prior to the final cleaning and test ride. During the test ride, check the operation of all electrical components, including the cooling fan. After the test ride, check the engine for oil leaks and check the oil level. This concludes our look at the valve lash procedure. In the next section, we will demonstrate the basic procedures for removing and installing the engine. Refer to the service manual for complete instructions and specifications. Engine removal requires that the motorcycle be supported on a lift with an extra side space. Table extensions are available from many lift manufacturers to extend the workspace. This wider workspace is needed to provide a surface for the engine assembly support fixture to roll on. If you do not have a lift with a wide table, you will need to perform the removal on the floor. Do not attempt to remove or install the engine without the support fixture. We have secured the bike to the lift and installed the scissors jack under the fuel tank to raise the rear wheel. We have also removed or disconnected these items using the procedures shown in the earlier programs. Radiator and steering head covers, maxi fuse, upper and lower airbox assembly, battery and ground cable, fuel lines and throttle body, coil and sensor connections, wiring harnesses, connections and horn assembly, and we drained the engine oil. If you are replacing an engine assembly, you will have the throttle bodies attached to the engine. The engine wiring harness is also left on the engine. The engine wiring connector is located on the upper left side of the frame rail. On the left side of the radiator, you will disconnect the connectors for the charging, fan, and crank position sensor, and the frame clip in the lower frame rail. Remove the brake reservoir on the right side and then remove the two fasteners which attach the cover assembly on each side. With the bolts removed, pull out the tabs to release them from the collars and slide the cover assembly forward to remove it. To drain the engine coolant, remove the radiator cap and the drain bolt on the left side of the radiator. Dispose of the coolant in accordance with local regulations. Replace and torque the drain bolt when the flow stops. Using a long-bladed screwdriver, loosen the clamps on both the upper radiator hoses. Remove the bolts holding the lower support brace to the frame. The bracket can remain attached to the radiator. Next, loosen but do not remove the two nuts on the two studs at the top of the radiator so that the bottom of the radiator can be swung forward. The oil lines attached to the engine using compression fittings. The torque on the fittings into the crankcase is lower than the torque of the nut onto the fittings. Use a 7/8 crowfoot wrench to hold the fitting to the crankcase and another to loosen the nut. A small amount of oil will drain from the line. With the oil line disconnected, disconnect the overflow line from the coolant tank. Remove the regulator connector and remove the two upper nuts. The radiator can be slid off the frame studs. Keep the radiator upright to prevent fluids from leaking out. To drain the remaining coolant from the engine, remove the crankcase plug at the front of the engine. Remember not to mix oil and coolant in the same container. Replace and torque the bolt when the flow stops. With the cooling system drained, you can remove the lines from the water pump and thermostat housing and both coolant pipes. Next, remove the final drive pulley cover and belt guards. Remove the 3 bolts attaching the pulley to the flange. These bolts will need to be replaced. With the transmission in gear, bump the rear wheel to move the pulley on the flange until the slots align. Then, loosen the belt tension and slide the pulley off the flange. Begin the removal of the exhaust system by removing the 2 bolts holding the upper muffler to the lower muffler. Next, loosen the upper muffler clamp and slide the upper muffler off the auxiliary volume. Next, remove the heat shields covering both head pipes. Use gaffers or painter's tape or other protective coverings on the frame, primary cover, and starter motor to prevent scratching during removal and assembly. Do not use duct tape or other heavy adhesive tape, which can stick to the finish. Next, remove the front lower bolt and L bracket attaching the lower muffler to the muffler mount. Next, remove the two nuts attaching the exhaust flanges to the cylinder head on both cylinders. Now, remove the nut on the rear mount pin. Support the exhaust system and slide the pin out. The exhaust assembly can now be removed as an assembly. Remove the cover and clutch actuator from the primary cover, leaving the line attached. Next, remove the battery cable from the starter and the solenoid from the left frame rail. We are now ready to begin to loosen the engine mounts. The first step is to position the engine assembly support fixture under the engine. The installation direction for the fixture is marked, and the two closely spaced socket head bolts face the rear of the engine. Align the socket head bolts with the oil pan indents. Lower the support jack until the engine rests on the fixture. Loosen the front motor mount through bolt until the load on the mount is removed. With the engine supported, remove the bolts attaching the front mount to the engine. Next, remove the studs attaching the mount to the frame. Remove the bolt attaching the lower tie link to the engine case. Do not alter the length of this link. To remove the pivot shaft, hold the hex on the shaft head and remove the nut from the left side. Adjust the frame jack to remove the load from the shaft and slide the shaft out. Leave the swing arm in place, but loosen the upper and lower bolts on the right side support. Do not remove these two bolts. The nuts are captured in the frame pockets and can fall out during removal or installation and become trapped. On the left side, remove the shaft linkage arm from the engine shaft. Leave the linkage attached to the foot lever. Remove the ground cable from the frame. Remove the 4 bolts attaching the left side frame rail and remove the rail and shift linkage as an assembly. Pull on the handles of the engine fixture to work the engine free of the rear mounts. When the engine moves forward, disconnect the neutral light and rear brake light wires under the engine. On California models, you will also disconnect hoses for the charcoal canister. Disconnect the speed sensor connector above the rear cylinder. Adjust the scissors jack to position the frame for clearance. Then rotate the engine out the left side of the frame. Refer to the directions in the service manual for installation procedures. Always use thread locking compounds as directed and coat the pivot shaft and axle with anti-seize during assembly. Torque all fasteners to the specifications listed in the service manual or bulletins. Harley Davidson has updated the torque specifications for the oil line connections from the listings in the initial service manual. The fittings in the engine crankcases are to be torqued to 25 to 30 Newton meters. Hand thread the line nut onto the case fitting. While holding the fitting on the case with a thin 7/8 wrench or crow's foot, tighten the line nut to 50 to 55 Newton meters. When filling the cooling system, remove the air bleed plug from the coolant line. Slowly add Harley Davidson extended life coolant through the filler neck. The system capacity is 2.4 liters. Fill the system until the coolant reaches the bleed port. Install and torque the air bleed plug. Add coolant to the level line in the overflow bottle and install the pressure cap. After the engine has been run to operating temperature, allow it to cool down. Recheck the level in the overflow bottle and adjust it as necessary. This concludes the third program in the VRSC series. Future programs will cover major engine service and electrical diagnostics. As with any new model, the procedures and specifications shown in the program can change. Service manuals, bulletins, and tech tips should always be used for service information and specifications.